Hi, this is Joe with Carbon Marine. Today I want to talk about buoyancy and push poles and the misconception that you need the lightest, longest push pole that you can possibly find in the marketplace. To properly explain this, it takes a little bit of a understanding of some physics. So when you are working with a push pole, what you're paying for when you buy a push pole is for the length and how stiff that push pole is made and how much weight is in that push pole. So the higher you go up the push pole price paradigm, you're getting a lighter pole that's stiffer that costs more because the manufacturing process to make something very long is exponentially more expensive than to make something shorter. So when folks come to me and say, hey, I'm new to push poling, I'm not sure which push pole I want the best push pole I can get. Well, that's a trick question because there's no one best solution. It depends upon the circumstances. So I'll give you a couple scenarios. If you're new to poling, you're more than likely to make some mistakes. So you may need a push pole that's a little shorter and that's more flexible so that if you do end up in a compromising situation, a more flexible carbon fiber push pole is less likely to break as early or as soon as a expensive push pole that's longer and stiffer. So that's one of the misunderstandings, is that you need to buy the most expensive push pole, and that's not always true. So your circumstances vary based upon the situation and your level of skill. If you're a very experienced guide and you've been push poling for a long time and you really know what you're doing, then I would recommend a 24-foot G3, which is our stiffest, lightest, most popular push pole, but that's not the best push pole for everybody. The second misnomer or myth about push poling is that you need the lightest push pole. And here's the problem that creates. Push poles, think of them like a cork. If you took a push pole and you stood it on end in 50 foot of water so it doesn't touch the bottom, there's a point at which it's going to find a buoyancy and it's going to float because it's a hollow tube. When you start getting into longer push poles, that push pole now has more length in the column of water. And I'm going to demonstrate that with one of the props that I have here. So let's take a look at that. We're going to have a mind experiment here. We're going to pretend that this is a pool of water, and these two push poles are the surface of the water, and this is our actual push pole. And what I'm going to do is I'm demonstrating the physics associated with a long push pole and buoyancy. So when you plant the push pole, let's say this is the point at which you've planted the push pole and you've got 4 feet into the water, clearly not enough to make it float. But now, as you're poling, more and more and more of that push pole is underwater. And it's going to get to a point where you still got quite a bit of push pole to utilize that's out of the water, that's in forward of your hands, but you've got the majority of the push pole now almost horizontal in the water. The problem with this is that buoyancy starts to kick in and the tip of the push pole will want to float up. And you don't feel it necessarily until somebody brings it to your attention, but now you're spending an inordinate amount of your energy trying to keep that push pole in touch with the bottom, or else it's going to lift and it's going to slip and you're not going to take advantage of that extra 4 feet of push pole that you paid a premium price for. So now what I would say is let's look at our options for finding a push pole that's long and that doesn't have such a high buoyancy rate. That might be our G2LR. We build that push pole in 24 feet. The push pole is a little bit heavier because it has 2 double wall thickness ferrules and it makes it a little heavier. Or you may want, if you're on hard bottom that's slippery, you may want to use our Javelin tip, which is a T6061 aluminum weighted heavier tip that will add weight to the push pole that will help keep it in contact with the bottom. The summary of all of this is to say this: there's no one push pole that's best for everybody. And I use 2 analogies that kind of demonstrate the point. The first one I would say is like shoes. You don't necessarily wear golf shoes to a ballroom dance or to a business dinner, right? It's a different type of environment, different type of shoe. So a golf shoe is good for golf, a dress shoe is good for casual and dining events. So think of push poles like that. Secondly, I use the analogy of race cars, right? If you got a lot of money, let's say you got an infinite amount of money and your wife says, I want an expensive car. You wouldn't go buy her a Sprint Cup car because, yeah, it's an expensive car, but it's really hard to use because it's got a very narrow window of forgiveness. One piece, very long, very light, very stiff push poles have a very narrow window of forgiveness. So if you're new to poling or if you're accident prone by nature, that push pole may not be the best choice for you. You may be better off with a more flexible push pole at a lower price point. So lastly, I would say when you're considering a push pole, take in where you're going to fish. If you're fishing in super soft bottom, Louisiana marsh, or super deep water, oceanside tarpon fishing in the Keys, you're going to need something longer. So you may want to look at the buoyancy challenges when you make the choice for a longer pole. If you're fishing in the Bahamas or you're fishing in, say, the west coast or the east coast of Central Florida, you may be able to get away with a 21 or 22 foot push pole. Longer is not always better. Shorter is not always better. Factor all of the variables of where you're fishing and your level of expertise to the type of pole, the length of pole, and the weight of the pole.